Let's go. Welcome, everybody, to 52 Living Ideas. This is Comprehensivist Wednesdays that we do in collaboration with the Greater Philadelphia Thinking Society. And today, it's wonderful to have Phil back. And he always talks about language, which is one of his favorite topics. So today, let's see what he has for us. Go ahead.
Yes, so we are actually concluding with this tonight's session. We're concluding our series on linguistics that we started with Saussure. And of course, that series was predicated on our involvement with Auerbach and tracing mimesis or representation in Western literature. And then we kind of veered off into this more specific area of, well, representation is all about language, so let's figure out what that is. And so just as a quick reminder and a recap of where we've been, we started with Ferdinand de Saussure, who is considered to be the father of linguistics. In a lot of ways, he sets the stage for all subsequent developments in linguistics. And the foundational idea that Saussure proposed was this idea of a sign in language. And the sign, of course, is this coupling of two things, a signifier and a signified. And just to remind you, a signifier is a type of code. It could be a word, it could be a sign code in sign language or a picture. And then a signified is the actual concept that this code is tied to. So when you have the two together, something really interesting happens. It becomes a single entity in our minds. So when you think about anything, I dare you to try to think without thinking about words or using words to think about anything, but you really can't. So in your mind, the two things are really fused. And that's something that Saussure observed, and then he made an important observation that actually turns out that the signifier is arbitrary. A lot of times, or not, well, sometimes signifiers are based on phenomena, like when you have a word that sounds like what it is, but most of the time it has nothing to do with the concept. And that's why in different languages, different concepts are named differently. And so you have to learn different languages. You can't just go cross over to another language easily. So that was Saussure. And the idea was, now that you have this sort of cloud of signs, how do you make sense of them? And his second observation was that this happens by the process of relation and differentiation specifically. In other words, things are defined by difference, by subtraction of one concept from another. So the way you learn is you figure out from the earliest age, something is this or it isn't, and you have this sort of very clear-cut separation of different things because they are different. I mean, it sounds tautological, but it's not, because when you think about learning a new concept, what you do is you start with something familiar, and then you remove everything of that familiarity, and what's left, the nuanced version of this new concept, is what it actually is how it's defined. So I think previously I gave an example of something like a tree and bark, tree bark. So you think about everything that a tree is, and you think about everything bark is, and you kind of do a subtraction. And what's left when you subtract everything that is a tree, but it's not bark, then you have really what's left is defining bark. So that's this idea of how structure language works. And of course, this theory became known as structuralism, became very influential. The idea being that everything really is defined not through itself, not positively, but as a relation to other things. And this idea was carried into anthropology, sociology, a lot of other fields, became very influential in the mid-20th century. So then, as a follow-up to that, we talked about Roland Barthe. And Roland Barthe takes this idea and makes the following observation on top of it. And he says that, well, actually what happens is this signification, this process of assigning meaning, it actually doesn't stop with these base layer concepts and just word definitions of things. What happens is you build up a sign, like let's say rose, right? You have a concept of a rose and the word rose. And so together they form a sign. Now you take that sign and you create, and that sign becomes a vehicle, a signifier for a higher order concept. So a rose in our minds is not just a flower, it has certain connotations, right? And these connotations are the new concept that is assigned to this new sign. A sign that is already a product of the original signifier and signified now becomes a vehicle for carrying higher order concepts. And this process is how we get to mythology. Mythology, according to Roland Barthe, is a type of speech. It's communication. And the way it works is you create progressively new meanings from the base layer of language, and you keep assigning new values to new signs as you build it up. We talked about systems. In general, language is a system, and systems have this property of being open under system formation, meaning that once you form a system, then it itself becomes a building block for other systems to be formed. And in language, what we see is signs become building blocks. They become new signifiers for additional concepts, more and more complicated, more and more involved, up to the point where a word like a burden is not just a load, but it has all sorts of psychological and additional meaning. There are other words that are loaded with meaning, right? Some words that we're not even supposed to think of or say or use in certain contexts. Words are explosive in a lot of ways. And so this is what Roland Barthe was observing. And he wrote this book, Mythologies, which traces some of the myth formation that happens not in ancient Greece, not in Rome, but today. We take things that are on the surface ordinary, and we assign all sorts of additional meanings to them. Like he talks about detergent and the advertising for detergent that was common, I guess, in like 1950s. And the idea being that you're not just cleaning something, you're actually waging a war, a war on dirt, and you're winning that war. And of course, in the 1950s, United States and Soviet Union were in this stalemate confrontation, and the pictures of warfare and opposition, light and darkness, were very much to the point. So this advertising and these concepts, they really become ingrained, and we don't even think about them. Okay, so this was all recapping previous sessions. Now, today, we take these concepts even further. And Derrida, in a lot of ways, is sort of, I guess, the culmination of thinking about language, thinking about a language as a system. So Saussure postulated pretty much a static system of signs that are while the original signifier and signified are arbitrary, once they become part of a system, they are pretty much fixed. You cannot arbitrarily create new words and create new meaning. That was his idea. Barthe takes this concept and adds some nuances to it and says that, well, maybe the original words are in fact somewhat static, but the superstructure on top of it is nothing of the kind. And in fact, it is mediated by society. And all of his examples of modern day mythology essentially exemplifies this fluidity and the fact that new meanings are created all the time, as we all know. We have a new word for it, actually, memes, right? So mimetic signification happens all the time. Now, Derrida takes this construction, which is post-structuralism, a structure that is doesn't have inherent meaning in itself in the relationships, but a structure that takes outside external factors into creation of this relationship matrix, if you will. So he takes that concept and he actually says, well, you know what? I think that all of this needs to be questioned. The whole idea, the whole building that we've just built, it needs to be, if not destroyed, it needs to be approached with a very critical mindset. And so his ideas became somewhat controversial from the start. A lot of people thought that he was actually a charlatan and did not really have enough rigor to be a scholar. Very famously in 1980s, I think it was Cambridge that attempted to or nominated him to receive an honorary degree, and several dons at Cambridge voted against it. Something that never happened in the like 30 years prior to that. So it was very interesting. He finally did get the degree, the honor, but it was by a narrow margin, I believe. All of this to say that his ideas are indeed controversial, but I find them absolutely stimulating to think about. There's something about his unorthodox approach that is really interesting, and I really appreciate a viewpoint that is separate and adds additional information that I did not have before. So I hope you listen to the following with an open mind. Again, I realize that a lot of his ideas are very laden with all sorts of assumptions, and they are carried very often into politics. But let's try to think about them conceptually first, try to understand them at the conceptual level, and then we can figure out if we want to sort of adopt them and use them as a tool in our toolkit in understanding language. So what are his main tenets, if you will? Well, if you try to read his literature and his books and try to understand his thesis, you realize that he actually, strangely enough, he kind of evades summary. It's very hard to actually summarize what he says. Nevertheless, it is possible. But this is where I think if you try to summarize Derrida, you're actually not getting him, because his entire method is actually very similar to his conclusions. And therefore, you cannot follow a regular methodology of so let's analyze it, let's break it apart into simple parts, and then we'll synthesize it and put it back together. You can't do that with him, because his method is actually such that it evades this type of analysis. Now, why is that? Well, the first thing that Derrida postulates is that he says there are things in language that are undecidable. Now, if he makes a statement like that, you can see how it might be difficult, if he really believes that, it might be difficult to pin him down. If he says that language is undecidable, how do we arrive at meaning? How do we arrive at anything that we can actually put down on paper, if you will? It's not easy. But why does he say that? Does he actually have any basis for saying that language is undecidable? Unlike Saussure, of course, unlike Roland Barthe, who would both argue that language is decidable and there are these relationship structures that allow us to decide. Derrida says, no, language is actually very much of a wild card. And where does he derive this from? Well, he goes back to the basics. He goes back to the fundamental philosophers of Western civilization. Surprisingly, he doesn't go to Marx, he doesn't go to Hegel, he doesn't go to any of the moderns. He goes way back to Plato. And in Plato, specifically in this dialogue of Phaedrus, there's this very intriguing discussion about two things, speech and writing. And in the course of this dialogue, Plato, or rather Socrates, tells Phaedrus this sort of parable. And this parable goes like this. In ancient Egypt, there was a divine king. His name was Thoth. You probably know Thoth if you know anything about Hermeticism and mysticism, right? Thoth of Egypt. So Thoth is credited to have invented language. And in general, he was a great inventor of different things, including architecture, but writing was the main thing. And Thoth had a father who was a god. And when after he discovered writing, he comes back to his father and he says, look, Dad, here are all the wonderful things I discovered. Here is architecture, here is this, here's that, here's just a variety of different things. But here is an alphabet, a way to write things down. Isn't this wonderful, he says, that we will have a system that will allow us to help memorize things. It will help us to remember things because we can write them down. And his father says, actually, it's a terrible idea. Because what you will do is, instead of helping people remember things, you will only give them a tool to remind themselves of something without actually understanding it. And therefore, they will have the appearance of knowledge, but not the actual knowledge, because the words will be written externally, and the words themselves are dead. And the person who wrote them is dead, is not there to be interrogated. All you have is a record. And if you don't understand it, you will think that you can just have sort of an image of this understanding. And of course, the word for image is eidolon, idol. You will have an idol in your mind, and you will not actually have the understanding. Okay, so that's the parable. And we get several things from it. One of the words that is used in this discussion of speech and writing is this very curious Greek word, pharmakon. Now, you probably know what this word means, right? We have pharmacists, pharmacology. The word is actually very, very interesting. It's interesting in English and in Greek. The English word is drug. And of course, drug can mean two things. It can mean a medicine that heals, and it can also mean something that stupefies and can potentially kill you. In Greek, this duality is also reflected similarly, like in English. So you have the pharmakon can be both a medicine and a poison. And if you've read something like Medea or Circe, that word is used of both of them. And of course, you remember Medea, she poisoned her children, I believe, and also poisoned the what was it, the clothing of the new Jason's wife, and so on. And then Circe used the potions, the these medicinal herbs to produce magic potions that would have all sorts of effects. So the interesting word duality of poison and medicine in this word pharmakon, that's what's used here when Thoth describes writing. He says, this tool, this new technology that I've built is going to be a pharmakon for memory and for knowledge and for wisdom. And his father says, it will actually be the opposite, but the word, he still uses the word pharmakon, it will be like a drug that creates an illusion of knowledge, but not the actual thing. So we have two things here going on. We have speech and writing, and we have this duality of pharmakon. Now, Derrida takes this up and says, well, what is it? Is speech essentially a superior an opposite of writing? You have this opposition between speech and writing. It appears that Socrates definitely says that speech is superior. And yet, when you reread the dialogue, you realize that he actually is using this metaphor of writing to describe the true knowledge. So he says that a person who has true knowledge, he has these words inscribed in the person's soul. So he cannot get away from the metaphor of writing. And yet he is trying to say that writing is essentially bad, and it's like a poison to the soul. So there's this undecidability in one of the foundational works of Western philosophy. Now, furthermore, you have this concept of oppositions, opposites, right? Speech versus writing. Now, what is speech? Well, speech is something we're doing right here, right now. I'm present. You can hear me. You can ask me a question if you don't understand something. These words, I'm not reading them. I am producing them as I'm thinking about something. So it comes, if I don't know something, I will, whatever I say comes from the knowledge that I either have or don't have. Now imagine that I wrote everything down and I gave you a piece of paper. And then when you focus on the piece of paper, even if I'm in the room, you're not focusing on me. So I am not there. The only thing that's there is this externality that presumably summarizes some concepts, but you cannot really interrogate it. And there's definitely no guarantee that you are entering into the meaning of what's being said. I mean, you could be, but it's not guaranteed. You could be creating your own meaning very easily. As you read something, you create a meaning that's really a reflection of your own state of mind, your own ideas, your own context. And so speech seems to be privileged in that sense. It seems to stand in opposition to this other thing, the writing. And Derrida says, you know, this is a foundational thing in our culture. Our culture is built on this presupposition that speech is superior to writing, when in fact, it's undecidable. Because in the very metaphor of speech, Socrates uses the language that assumes that you can do the writing metaphorically on a person's heart, on a person's soul. Of course, in the Bible, there are all sorts of metaphors that are very similar. If you've read Jeremiah, I think there he says that God will write the law, not on the tablets outside externally, but on your heart internally, right? That's Jeremiah in the Bible. So completely different culture, but the same exact concept. And so it seems that you have another set of oppositions, an internal and external. The internal is privileged or considered a higher state than the external. And so as soon as Derrida notices this, he says, wait a second, everything in our culture and everything in our understanding of language seems to be built from these oppositions. They're everywhere. And in fact, that's what allows us to create meaning in language, is these oppositions. He calls them binary oppositions because a lot of times they're opposites. Speech and writing is not necessarily opposite. I mean, you wouldn't necessarily consider that, but most of them are opposite. Think of direction, up, down, left, right, light, dark. I mean, there's all sorts of oppositions, and these are the basic ones. But then we take those basic oppositions and we build new ones and kind of dice it and slice it to create more nuanced distinctions. Now, what do you notice about all of these oppositions? Again, says Derrida, well, they're not actually equal. They're not on equal footing. All of them have a privileged side, what he calls a privileged side, and a subservient side. So like we said, the internal is privileged over external. The right typically is privileged over left. Think of language. We have the word for right as in direction, but right is also a moral concept. Why is that? Well, most likely because most people are right-handed. So the right is what most people are, that's the normal way of behavior. Left is kind of a deviation from that. I mean, physically, right? Most people are right-handed, not left-handed. And in Latin, the word for left is sinister. So we get our word for sinister from that. So there's no question about it, that right is privileged over left in a lot of ways. Up is privileged over down, light is privileged over dark, and so on and so on. So Derrida says, okay, here's how it seems language and meaning, which is inherent in language, works. We have these binary oppositions, and that's actually what's setting up this relationship structure that allows us to tease out meaning in just about anything. We have everything is defined in terms of these opposites. But, he says, if you look carefully, you'll find that in our culture and in our writing and in our foundational texts, there are things that are markedly undecidable. They don't fit one category or the other. And he makes a couple of really good examples of that. So one of these examples is this concept of a virus. It's a self-referential concept because Derrida compares himself to a virus. He says a virus enters something, an organism, and it does two things. It disrupts communication. It disrupts this process of coding and decoding, right? Of DNA code encoding into RNA and so on. And it also disrupts the flow of communication. But also, on top of all of that, it's undecidable. Is virus a living thing, or is it a dead thing? By itself, a virus seems dead. It's just some proteins sitting there. They could sit there forever. It doesn't do anything. It can't reproduce. It can't feel. It can't do anything. But as soon as you put it inside of a living tissue, it turns alive again, or supposedly. And then it's sort of alive, but not really, because then it can go back to the dead state very quickly. If the host dies, virus dies. So it inhabits this in-between space, a space between living and dead, just like some of these concepts. So that's virus. That's a picture for us to think about. Another really curious one, and probably the one that is more fun to think about, is this concept of a zombie. A zombie is something that is neither alive nor dead. It is something that kind of lives in between. It's not, you can't really put it in one category or the other. It eludes this clever classification that we have. It's kind of both. And it's kind of disturbing because of that. We can't really rationally place it in any one bucket, because sometimes it's definitely alive and scary, but at the same time, it wouldn't be scary if it wasn't dead. But of course, if it was just dead, then it would be stationary and it would stay in one place and wouldn't go anywhere. So a zombie is this very curious picture of something that is in between, doesn't occupy a particular pigeonhole, if you will, but it eludes this classification. A third picture that I also really like is this picture of a joker in a hand of in a deck of cards. A joker is not any specific card. Now it could become a particular card if you have a hand, but then it becomes a joker again, which is no card at all. In some games, it has no value. In some games, it has supreme value. So it occupies this interesting space that is elusive of classification again. So joker, zombie, virus, and then of course we talked about the concept of pharmakon itself. The word itself eludes classification. And then we have this idea of speech and versus writing, and whether or not the two can be in fact strictly pigeonholed into these opposites. And Derrida says no, they cannot be, because they are implied. One is implied in the other. And you can see that in Plato. Plato cannot actually describe the true way of communication without going back to writing as a metaphor. But of course, on the other side, we wouldn't even know about Plato. We wouldn't even know about Socrates if it wasn't written down. So all of our literature is in fact written, right? We wouldn't have, our civilization really wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for writing. So writing, in some ways, is privileged over speech, but in other ways, speech is privileged over writing. They seem to occupy this in between, this undecidable position that is constantly in motion. It eludes a classification. I was also thinking about another aspect of speech, which is, think of a court of law. Think of a written testimony versus oral testimony. Which one is privileged? Which one is considered of higher value, written or oral? Well, obviously oral, because a person, like we said, when you speak, a person is there and they can be interrogated, they can be cross-examined, they can be, you can kind of throw various arguments at them, versus a written testimony is dead. in a lot of ways, like a zombie. It just lays there, and you have to figure out what it means, and if it's reputable, and if it carries weight, if it's forged, if it's real. Whereas a person is immediately there, and so speech in that regard is definitely occupies the privileged position. All right, I think I'll stop here to see if there's any feedback, any thoughts that you guys want to.
All right. Phil, this is just amazing. I mean, you do this again and again. This is just the range of topics that you have put on the table is incredible. So I just wanted to appreciate that for a few minutes, and then hand it over to anybody else who wants to ask any questions or make any comments. In the really, I don't know whether this is in Derrida himself or it is your ability to put it. I'm not familiar with the gentleman, so I'm just going to talk about connections between what you have said, between various things that we have studied. Okay, this is the dance between the ground and the figure. There is a continuous dance going on between figure. You can see the figure with the context of the ground, but the ground is always there, and you can figure is there in the foreground is something that you can focus on very easily, but it arises from the ground and goes back to the ground. There is the issue of, you can look at it in terms of Jung that we have studied, the conscious and the subconscious. The subconscious is drawn on this unconscious that you have. You're drawing on that in order to bring things into consciousness. Your consciousness is limited, and what you're focusing on at the same time, what you're focused on is driving the subconscious. So there is this loop going on between them continuously. This is a topic that Walter Ong talks about, that we've talked about. He says all text is pretext. And my adjoiner to that is all text is pretext because it is missing the context. Because there is a context that when you are actually thinking, you are looking at the context and you are formulating your thoughts based on the context. When you put it in text form and it doesn't have that entire rich context surrounding it, you can pretend to know what is going on, but you might only have an idle unless you do the work yourself in order to build the context to certain things yourself. McLuhan talks about this. Mark Stallman has done this entire series about it, but it distinguishes between oral culture, scribal culture, and the print culture. Actually, what he's trying to describe is that he's pitting this oral culture against print culture. And to understand this, actually, you have to focus on the scribal culture, where during the scribal era, people dealt with text in the context of talking. Whether it is Aquinas at University of Paris, or Aristotle in his peripatetic school, or in Gurukuls of India, or in Lao Tzu and his students. They have text, but all text is covered by this envelope of speech, and the speech goes back into the text. So there is this virtuous loop that is going on between that. In print, you suddenly have a book, and you feel that you have that. You have what that entire context is, but you don't. It's very easy to make idle out of that. So that is the print era. In oral, your transmittability is very limited. You're just talking to the people around you. You can't really transmit it any further. You're not able to kind of build on knowledge as well, because you do not have an externality that is there. Again, the point that you brought up about internality and externality is very profound, and it applies to many things. It applies even to speech. I'm speaking now. What I'm saying is out there. It is, there is thought in me, but when the word is spoken out, it is accessible, it is objective for other person to grasp. At the same time, it is just air. And the other person has to do the work in order to take the words and put it back together. So in this problem of transmission is very much there in speech itself, in over and above writing. But the beauty of the speech is that if you have the back and forth, it's the conversation. It's a question of direction. Are you going to say, this is the book and just figure it out yourself? Or are you going to go back and forth with the book as the peripatetics did, as the Gurukul people did? There was this envelope. Another way of saying is that, knowledge is bidirectional. It's a feedback loop. And the integrity of it is maintained by it. The scribal era is all about integrity of kind of connection, close connection between words, actions, emotions, writings. And that is the middle thumb which bring all of it together. So this is just beautiful observations about the oral versus the print. But it is saying that those are the bifurcations. But there are things in the middle where both these things are very beautifully integrated together. And the differences between them are being used in order to correct the limitations of each. So just wonderful. This is great topic. Thank you so much for bringing this up. Folks would love any comments about anything. We'll start with Dave from Tacoma. Dave.
Thank you very much, Shakan, and enjoying the talk, Phil. As a left-handed person, I have observed the judgmental words of those two words. My favorite is French. The right hand is adroit, or in other words, adroit. In other words, skillful, graceful. And left-handed, of course, is gauche. Like, we stumble while I walk. So some of the languages, and just there's how much judgment there is in words. I was thinking about tall versus short. There's a famous song in the 60s about worthless how short people have no reason to live. And but then I can think about the witness. I will disagree with you about a witness in a courtroom, because speech can change and the written word does not change. You bring the written word into the courtroom, it does not change, but your witness that's speaking, he may come to the courtroom and say something completely different than you expect and contradict or make a fool of himself. So anyway, but it's very good observations. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Dave reminds me of one more. Folks, go ahead and type exclamation mark to put your comments in. This is an amazing topic. Would love to have people discuss it. I just want to say this right versus left is a very large issue. Right brain versus left brain. It is a question of, focusing on order versus chaos, and being able to go between them and not being able to go between them, being able to see patterns which are new patterns at the edge of possibilities, or going with the patterns that you already have. So the left versus right is, again, brain-wise, is a very large issue. Next up is Maritza, followed by Joe. Maritza.
As another left-handed person, I too raise eyebrows at that. I will say the example that Dave just gave about au gauche or à la droite. It's interesting because gauche doesn't mean it doesn't mean something negative in French, but it has taken on that connotation in English. So it's interesting. I had never considered that, because droite in French just means that it's right. But the idea of the words taking on this meaning, I think what is most fascinating is that you called out all these pairs of opposites, and they bring to mind, we have been diving increasingly here in our thinking group here, this is 52 Living Ideas group. We've been ever increasingly tackling the question of why are we so very firmly entrenched in this us versus them mentality, and how can we combat it? And I feel like you've touched upon this very essential aspect. It's so very ingrained, because it's kind of written into the very fabric of our society, like literally. if what if what I'm understanding, you're saying that we consider these concepts of up, down, left, right. We're considering them because they're taken from something that was biased eons ago, and now we've walked forward with it so long that they've become, like, the metaphors have become what we perceive to be, the real thing, because we tend to forget that they're like, it's not the literal thing. And it's a fascinating thought experiment to me when trying to tackle, like, well, then how do we, get away from the idea of us versus them mentality. I have to admit, it seems ever more daunting after your speech, but not speech, after your knowledge that you've imparted upon us. Daunting, but also like intriguing, because if one can perhaps find awareness of the fact that these are imposed, and not even, I mean, they're technically self-imposed because all of us are accepting to continue forward with these, but they're imposed by, our ancestry, our history. If we can strive towards that awareness, perhaps then that is the key to beginning to change the mentality. And it has to be done by changing, the signifier, as it were, like a metaphor. What you're saying is that it would be, when I was younger, I had the idea that, I had a cause, and I was like, oh, I had the thought that there were two opposing views, and they each had different labels. And I was like, that label's really strange and imprecise. I'm going to convince people to use a different label. I am one person, and that was an abject failure. But it was the idea of, like, so I had been thinking that, um, and forgive me, I'm not trying to be political in either direction, and I'm not stating a preference, but it is common knowledge that here in the United States, people who consider themselves to be against, like against abortion, call themselves pro-life. And I'm not making a commentary in any direction on anyone's belief system. I'm just saying it's fact that when one hears the term pro-life, one thinks of people who are against abortion. And when one hears the term pro-choice, one thinks of people who are for abortion. To me, that always seemed very odd, because I was like, does that then presuppose that people who are in um, in alignment with, the questions of abortion and such, are they anti-life? Because if you're saying that they're not, if this group is calling themselves pro-choice, then the opposing unspoken word phraseology must then be anti-life. Or in the other direction, if this one is pro-choice, then this one must be anti-choice. But that's not actually true. So it kind of, I stuttered looking at that one, and you can see so many examples of that in our common day-to-day interactions. It's we Without it being expressly stated, the mind jumps to labeling the other or them with the opposing concept. So you don't have to say that somebody is anti-life, because if you're saying pro-life, I'm jumping in my mind to the conclusion that the other, the them, must therefore be this anti, because pro must go with anti. And
Shika,
you're,
real quick.
sorry.
Can I comment on your statement real quick? So one of the things that I didn't mention, but you actually kind of spelled out in what you were saying, is the following. Derrida noted that these binary oppositions are defined in terms of each other. And that's another key about them. So light and dark, you cannot really define either of those unless you have the opposite. And so they need each other, and yet they kind of oppose each other. That's the paradox.
Yes, and they hinder other.
Right. But his idea was that actually they're an illusion, essentially, is what he's saying. That these binaries are an illusion, and really life happens not in these opposite poles, like the North Pole and the South Pole, which is in itself a good metaphor. Nobody really lives on the South Pole or the North Pole. People live in between. And if you want to sum up Derrida's method, it's really pulling things that in our minds are polar opposites and actually saying that there is this wonderful spectrum and gamut that exists in between what we consider to be kind of the foci of meaning. The meaning in his mind is actually these in-between areas, the things that are unsaid, not the words, but the absence of what's written, right? And we'll talk about that in a second, but I just thought that what you were saying about these opposite labels, that pretty much exactly sums up his stance, his deconstructive method of saying that because binaries need each other, you need to actually just reject them because they are a distraction. Real life happens in between.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Excellent. This is going to be an amazing discussion. So this is great. Next up is going to be Joe, Katie, and Dave. Joe.
Yeah, so I just, one of my questions is that language is actually created from our sensorial experience, right? And so from that perspective, is he deconstructing how we experience the world, essentially, all our senses and how we view it, like what we experience? Is that essentially what he's trying to pull apart?
I don't know that.
And make them more objective. So the idea of light and dark, just like as you said, right? So you take that, and that's an experience, right, that we have. So we're saying it's light, we're saying it's dark, and that they're opposites, right? So actually, that's our senses, right? So then is he trying to separate our experience from the world, from the words that we use?
No, I don't think so. I think what he's pointing out, and let's look at that, light and dark. Do we experience light as an absolute or dark as an absolute? We really don't. We have shades. We can say it's lighter or darker. We can at some point, maybe in the dead of night, possibly if there are no stars and no moon, we can experience absolute darkness. Or maybe if we go into a cave. But that's not our regular experience. 99% of the time, we experience life in between the two theoretical opposites of light and dark. Everything else is really shades of gray, if you will, pardon the reference. And so that's how it is when you think about it. A lot of life is like that. Again, and I'm trying to I guess portray or express Derrida's position. That's not necessarily my position, but I have to say I do agree with it to a degree that, in fact, if language is based on our sensory apparatus and our concepts are essentially abstractions from the sensory input, our sensory input doesn't live in these pure opposites. Left and right, up and down, maybe. But again, what's up is if I go up to the Kilimanjaro, I'm higher than you are, maybe. But someone else can go higher to Mount Everest and so on. So in other words, it's gradations, right? So really, it's just relations, higher, lower. Which one is privileged? Well, we typically think of something that's higher, like higher education, right? High school. There's just all kinds of obvious references there that imply that something that's higher is better. Something that's lower is worse, right? Just our language is very clear about that. But in reality, does that actually work? Is lower necessarily worse? Can a child be worse than an adult because he's lower? looking at light and dark, I mean, there's all kinds of racist implications in that that are obvious. There's all sorts of various ways that traditionally we've looked at these things, and without thinking, not even being explicit, we've subscribed to these oppositional logic. But Derrida says that actually, if you look very carefully, even at the foundational texts of Western canon, you will find that there's all sorts of undecidables in all of these examples. And his conclusion after studying all of it is to say language itself is really an undecidable system. It's not a fixed system like Saussure or Roland Barthe might say. It's actually a very fluid system with meaning kind of swimming in between these areas. And it's up to us to figure out kind of our own place in that.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Katie.
Yeah, and I with light and dark, both are part of the system of a sky. So that's like that's a unity in that, even though we're experienced it, you know, each from one moment to the next, it's not broken up, and it's just like we're experiencing it, and it's always kind of changing, and then till it's extremely dark, and then till it's extremely light. So
Wonderful. Thank you. A quick comment by Dave, and then we'll continue to the next section. Let me ask Phil one thing. Phil, how many sections do you have?
I actually just have two. So this first one and the second one, and so after that, it's kind of free for all.
Okay. Then let me do one thing. Let's go to Dave, and then I have a. You know what? I'll make my observation after the second section. We'll have plenty. Dave, go ahead.
Thanks so much. I know we could talk several hours about abortion, but just a couple of quick things, because the thing is, these
not
words,
politics. Don't go too much into politics, okay? Only on language.
No, yeah, but the thing is, the language makes it simplistic, and because no one really wants abortion, but our side wants there to be the possibility it can be available when it's needed, because a woman can come to the hospital with a miscarriage, the baby's already dead, and you can stand there and my God, I'm going to make her deliver. Well, she's going to die from, so anyway, yeah, the thing is that it's a complicated world. It's not black and white all the time, but thanks much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe that's also maybe as albeit simplistic, but a good summary of really what Derrida is after. Our world, and keep in mind too, when he started writing this was in late 50s, early 60s, and the world was much more black and white back then. So you have to take that into account when you kind of maybe prejudge him a little bit, because today the world is very different. And a lot of these ideas that in large part, maybe thanks to him, have percolated through the educational system and through our political systems, and really even our consciousness. We live in a very different world, not a world that was very much segregated, and a world that was clearly demarcated by external versus internal, official versus unofficial. A lot of things have changed. So just kind of bear that in mind. The context of Derrida was 1950s and 1960s world, a world that was very much, I guess, characterized by polarity, right? In every possible way, right? Polarity in political systems, polarity in racial systems, apartheid, and so on. I mean, it was just everywhere. And so he wrote, when he was writing this stuff, it was actually very much of a liberating type philosophy. Whereas perhaps today, if we take it too far, you know, any idea taken too far is going to be this pharmacon, but in a way that you don't want it to be a pharmacon, right? Instead of a medicine, it becomes a poison. And so the duality of his ideas has to be taken into account. His own method tells us that you cannot classify his ideas as good or bad. They're neither. They're in this gray zone. And if you apply them one way, they might be medicinal and bring healing. Or if you apply them in a different way, they can, like any medicine, taken too much, it will cause destruction. And perhaps maybe we've drunk him too much in some ways. And I know a lot of you like Peterson and so on. And, you know, to a degree, you can see that his ideas could be destructive as well. But at the time that they were written, at the time that he was promulgating them, they were probably very much needed. And so that has to be taken into account as well. Okay, so moving on, we talked about the basic, I guess, mode of operation, not really a definition of his method, but a mode of operation being like a virus that infects a body of text, if you will, any body of text, and starts looking for these oppositions and then undermining them. And as it undermines them, it undermines the communication systems of that text. One of his classical examples is the Constitution of the United States, not the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And Derrida famously took that document and started deconstructing it from the inside and just trying to see, not criticizing it from outside like we typically do, right? A lot of times when we look at a text, we start engaging with its ideas, but that's not what Derrida does. He doesn't engage with the ideas. He engages with the text itself. And so he starts looking for things that are there. He starts looking for words that are used and the meaning that's implied in them and not implied in them. And he kind of is like a little worm that burrows inside this text and eventually comes out and the text is gone somehow, and it's all over the place. It's like becomes kind of disentangled. That's his method, which eludes really classification, but that's his kind of strategy of seeking out these oppositions, figuring out where they actually fail or where the implications of them fail or are untenable anymore, or if they ever were tenable, and then kind of proceeding from that. As he does this, he discovered something else that was crucial in his journey, which is this concept of trace. Now, what is trace? Trace is something that's left behind, right? You go on a boat and you leave a trace. You're not there. The boat has gone on, but the trace, the wake, is still there. And in linguistical systems, a trace is something that is not explicitly there, but it's implied. So when you think of a word pig, think of all the other words that are implied but not actually spoken, right? You might think of dirt, you might think of oinking, you might think of a million other things. All those other words, that's the trace. Now, phonetically, when you say pig, how do you differentiate that from other words? Well, it's the p sound versus the b sound. Because if you said big, then that would have its own trace, and that trace would be different. And so all of these concepts, all of our words have this trace as a necessary precondition for us to actually communicate. If we didn't have that, if we didn't have kind of this wake of meaning that surrounds concepts, then we really, our communication would be very poor, very inexact perhaps, and definitely not as interesting, because it wouldn't have this context that's always present and yet always absent. Notice how trace in itself is occupying this middle position. It's not really present, but it's not really absent. So when you look at a text, as Derrida does, what he's looking for is trace. He's looking for things that are sort of there, but are not explicitly spoken. Things that are not there because they are meant to be not there, and things that are not there because they're implied. Both of those are important, right? The concepts that are implied are important, but also things that are explicitly left out for some reason are important. Like in the Declaration of Independence, famously, you have a lot of groups of people that are left out, that are not there. Is this omission accidental or is it intentional? Either way, it's important. And so Derrida, his method of deconstruction is not just looking at stuff that's there, like traditional textual criticism does. It actually looks at stuff that's not there. In some ways, it's very similar to apophatic theology. Apophatic theology just defines God and defines these concepts in terms of what they are not. It doesn't specifically say what they are. It says God is not in any one place. He is not this, not, or not that. So Derrida takes the same approach and says, okay, we have to look at not just what's there, but what's not there. And more importantly, this concept of trace is what allows meaning to exist. So it's the unspoken medium that actually envelops signs that we use to communicate. So every sign, besides being embedded into this mesh of other signs and the difference between them, it is also enveloped in this sort of fluid trace that surrounds its expression. And this trace is what Derrida is after when he does his deconstruction. Okay. So what is another way to look at this idea of deconstruction? I mean, everybody is talking about it or has been talking about when they talk about Derrida. If you start defining it, then you really don't get it, because like we said, the idea is not to have some sort of analytical tool for dissection. The idea is you get into the text, and from the inside out, you start building out and unraveling the meaning that's implied in the text itself. Now, how do you do that? Well, we said that first thing you do is you try to identify the oppositions in the text, the things that are opposites. And any text will have those. Like, I mean, very simply in Plato, the opposites were internal versus external, true knowledge versus fake knowledge, versus memory versus reminding, right? You have these opposites. The second thing you do is you look at the boundaries. And the boundaries, this word boundary is super interesting in itself. Think of the word to define, definition. Well, what is definition? Well, it comes from Latin fine. Fine is the end. You draw it where something ends, you draw a line where something ends and something else begins. That's how you define things. You draw a boundary around something. If there's no boundary, the meaning itself starts to become very uncertain, right? The ground is shifting under your feet if you don't have a set boundary around something. Boundaries is what gives everything in our lives meaning. Internal, external. How do we know? Well, there's a boundary. You cross the boundary and now you're on the outside. You cross another boundary, now you're on the inside. Left or right, again, there's a boundary between those two concepts. If you erase the boundary, the concepts start kind of like in the Matrix movie, right? That spoon starts to kind of change its shape, right? It doesn't actually occupy its traditional space. So the deconstructive process is this questioning of boundaries and questioning of the hierarchies of these oppositions. Hierarchy of opposition just means that one is higher than the other. So we talked about right versus left, high versus low, light versus dark. They all have some implied hierarchical relationship. And typically the movement in a text is always from higher to lower, the one that's more, in Derrida's language, privileged versus the one that's less privileged. And so what happens if you invert that? What happens if you invert the movement and you actually start going from the lower to the higher? That already changes the meaning in a lot of ways and creates new, different meaning. And so this is the kind of the dynamics, if you will, of his deconstructive process. Deconstructive process, by the way, is not just something you do or can do in texts. Very interestingly, as soon as Derrida popularized his ideas, they started seeping into general culture. And one of the most intriguing ways, to me at least, was how deconstruction started influencing architecture. Well, it's one thing to say, well, we're just gonna, shake this whole thing up, all the textual meaning and so on. But what happens if you apply deconstruction to architecture? Are buildings gonna start falling apart? Are you gonna just start taking, putting the foundation on the rooftop and making maybe the rooftop on the bottom? No, that's not the point. And again, it's not about kind of this analytical approach of just switching things around, because when you put the rooftop on the bottom and the bottom on the top, all you've done is you've created a new hierarchy and a new set of oppositions. You haven't actually changed the dynamics of the thing. So to do that is very much anti-Derridian, if you will. What really needs to happen is you need to kind of smoothen and dilute these boundaries that separate one from the other. And so architecture of that type and architectural planning of that type tends to erase highly defined or clearly defined boundaries between one area and another. And there's a very interesting place in Paris that I actually want to go to now that I've read about it. It's called La Villette. It's this little village, the park, La Villette Park, that was built by a person, an architect who was very much influenced by Jacques Derrida. And I've looked at some photos of it. It's very interesting design. It kind of meshes all the different areas in this kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. And there's some, like, you have some pathways that all of a sudden lead nowhere. And there's just like architecture's kind of sprinkled in different ways. It sounds like kind of a hodgepodge and maybe kind of chaotic, but it's actually looks really nice and very unlike kind of the English gardens or something like that, which is very structured and very kind of rigid. This one has very kind of has this fluidity, and a lot of artists tend to go there and create their artwork. Also, just the general public, it seems to be kind of a hit with them. So it's a very nice area. Like I said, I've been to Paris, but I haven't been to that particular area. But I do recommend it for anyone who is interested to check it out, because you will see deconstruction in action, if you will. Of course, the other areas of deconstruction are in art and music. In art, the interesting concept that has been proposed is this idea of framing, right? We have a frame and an artwork is inside the frame. The frame constrains the artwork. And so we hang it on the wall because now you have something that you can sort of put a little rectangle around. But is art really something that needs to be contained? And a lot of pop art, a lot of street art, a lot of modern, even not just conceptual art, but even performance art is all about breaking that frame and actually saying that the frame is this artificial distinction, artificial opposition between what is part of artwork and what isn't. Art needs to be part of life in a way that doesn't really have a defined starting and ending point. And so a lot of buildings now in New York, especially, I've seen some of this architecture where it's not clear where it's functional or it's decorative. It's both, but it's kind of, it has this fluidity around it. So very interesting concepts of building design have been proposed from this idea of erasing this separation and bounding and kind of this, again, binary oppositions of these things. And they've resulted in some really interesting artwork, some really interesting building design. That is pretty much all I have for tonight, Shrikant. So unless maybe there are questions or yeah, we're happy to fill them.
All right. Thanks, Phil. So this is, I think, a very, very profound idea. So I do want to talk about it. I mean, I think that Jacques Derrida understands language and is systematically taking it apart. So you can't use language anymore. And I want to go through that of showing basically another way of thinking about it is my small version of it is that language is built on metaphors. That's how the language is. And there are all kinds of metaphors that are being used in order to build the language. It's basically using something that you're more familiar with to deal with something you're less familiar with. And it goes across, it uses the connotations and denotations in a particular way. The language does that. And what this is that this is kind of, he understands it very deeply and is taking apart everything that makes language work. So it's a really, really interesting thing. So I want to give the example of up and down and see how up and down is there in the language and how we use it. But that's going to be quite lengthy thing, but I want to give a chance for people to talk about, or to bring up anything, make any comments, and go from there. We'll start with Alison.
Yeah, deconstructionism has affected the way that literature has been taught, like in the last 20 years. Like when I first started teaching, the big thing was that you took literature and then you would try to make connections with other things. Like you'd always do text to self connections, text to text connections, and text to world connection. And now it's completely shifted over to something called close reading, which is really the whole idea is that you're just focusing on what's in the text, and you're not really, that anything outside of it doesn't really affect it. It's just supposed to stay right within the text. And I don't know, I found an interesting article that's kind of like parallels the connection between that. I don't know, I could let me see if I could put it in the chat for you, but anyway, I just thought I'd bring that up.
Thanks, Alison. Next up is Dave.
Yeah, I think, start with language, I think the connection is with stories. And I think we were talking about boundaries. There's been some documentaries on CNN, I think it was, about the different decades of different television, how we break this boundary, now we can do this, and the family shows are all over, now we're doing this. But also movies. I think it was Parasite that had a heck of a plot twist of what in the heck is going on here, and it won every award. But yeah, just the trying to tell a story a different way and a surprising way.
Thank you, Dave. Next up is Joe.
Yeah, I find the point about boundaries actually to be very interesting as well. Specifically, actually, when we were studying the Tao, it was very the idea that once you take the whole and divide it into parts, the parts need names. And then the idea that you're dividing things up. And if you keep dividing things up, I think that it does make language a little bit more difficult if you continue to name things. And it actually specifically talks about not to go too far, knowing when to stop naming thing is really important. So I think that there's this idea of kind of, I understand he's talking about boundaries, and I think if I'm understanding this correctly, he's talking about breaking down those boundaries and going even further and making everything contextual, which is kind of difficult. I mean, I see what he's saying, but I would not want to write the encyclopedia.
Can I comment?
Or the dictionary, I should say. The dictionary.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so that's a really good observation, Joe. That if you remove all boundaries, then like what are you left with? And an encyclopedia is exactly kind of that. You very hard boundaries everywhere. But you have to keep in mind as well that think about art. So in the 50s and the 60s, you had the concept of high art and low art. You had concepts of highbrow and lowbrow, even before that. These concepts, for better or worse, have pretty much been erased today. I think for better, because instead of someone else telling you this is highbrow literature, you can decide for yourself just whether you like it or not. So it kind of engages you, as opposed to creating these artificial silos that someone else, by the way, curates and decides for you where someone is placed. And this is, I mean, obviously, you can't really talk about Derrida without becoming political at some point, because his obvious insinuation and implication is that these hierarchies of meaning have not just plopped to us from the skies. A lot of times they're either something that's biological, but a lot of times something that was originally biological, but perhaps it has been supplanted and used by a certain set of people to keep other set of people subservient to them. So it's pretty clear that there's a lot going on here, and it's complicated. And you cannot pigeonhole even a particular binary opposite into saying, well, that's just evil. That in itself would be using the old methodology, right, of pigeonholing everything into A or B. Whereas you have to say it's both. It's actually both, and it's complicated. You have to have nuance to approach it correctly. As an example, by the way, and I hope you will appreciate this, a lot of people in the feminist movement, as soon as they heard about Derrida, they said, oh my goodness, that is wonderful. Let's put Derrida on a flag and march forward. But Derrida said, no, what you guys are trying to do actually is not what I would want you to do if you believe in what I have to say. So why did he say that? Because a lot of the feminist movement at that time, all they wanted to do is for women to become the men. So they're not destroying the opposition, the binary opposite in society. They're just saying we want to be on the other end of that pole, right? They want to take the other side, but the opposition remains. So you have the hierarchy, you just want to be at the other end of that hierarchy on the top versus the bottom. But that's not what Derrida is proposing at all. He says, let's erase the boundaries. Let's erase the boundaries insofar as they're keeping a particular class of people or gender or so on from achieving their full potential. But you cannot do that from the outside using the old tactics. You have to do it kind of from the inside. You have to pick the middle road. And what is the middle road? Well, the middle road is, for instance, something where instead of, let's say, women occupying and taking over all traditionally male-dominated professions, they create something completely new and explode the thing from the inside and occupy a completely new niche that men did not even think about. That would be truly kind of a Derridian, if you will, subversiveness, right? Where you don't just go and say, well, I'm just going to do the old thing that one class did to me. I'm going to do something completely different. And maybe, by the way, this is the Tao way, not the way of violence, right? And opposing something head on, but kind of a roundabout way where you take your time and you completely subvert the whole system by going around it. And so, unfortunately, this nuance is lost, and a lot of people don't want to take Derrida's ideas and just march forward with them. But keep in mind that Derrida actually broke with kind of some of the more ardent feminist movement proponents and said, no, you are misinterpreting my ideas. You actually are doing the old thing. And so let's see what happens with that.
Thank you. Next up is Todd. Oh, go ahead, Joe, you had something.
No, I was just going to add, I mean, it and I did read this about it. It's often used by postmodernists, and I can kind of see as to why. I mean, because there is no absolute kind of way of defining something, and I guess it leaves everything open to interpretation. So that's why, and there's no consensus or truth. So that and this is just resembling that in language. I mean, is that an accurate?
Yeah, I would say yes.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Next
I get
is
it.
Todd.
Thank you so much, Philip. This was really terrific. A really, really great presentation and summary of Derrida. And I had never, I had a misspent youth studying philosophy. So I read some Derrida once upon a time many years ago. But I never read Plato's Pharmacy, and I've always wondered, what's the Pharmacon about? And now I know. Thank you so much. I just want to make a couple of observations, and again, this is based on my hazy memory of Derrida, but also in response to some of the stuff you said. It strikes me that you began by kind of reviewing some key ideas in structuralism. And it's so interesting to me that the end of structuralism is kind of in its beginning. That is the idea of language as a system of differences, right? Which is a very early idea in structuralism. It kind of comes back to haunt us in Derrida's notion of the trace, right? Because that's the ultimate difference, right? I mean, he, you know, I think it's somewhere he says that the trace is the absence of a difference, or it's what's absent in it's at the absence it's the absence in presence, right? It's what's absent in presence. It's the mark of absence in presence, or something like this. So it really is, you know, but the structuralist idea that language is this kind of web of connections and relationships, and only is meaningful because each word is distinguished within this system, within this relational system, from other words, kind of already has this idea, right? That you know, language conveys meaning by difference, by that which is it's not. It's always referring to the difference in some way. Anyway, I'm not sure that's really true, but it just struck me that there's kind of a natural connection there.
Absolutely. I think most people would agree that without Saussure's work and without Barthe's work, Derrida would not likely have made such a splash, and
right.
really possibly would not have arrived at his ideas at all. Yeah.
The other thing, and this I think was totally implicit in everything you said, is that I think of the foundational, I shouldn't speak in those terms, Derrida would hate it, but the foundational opposition, as it were, is the opposition between presence and absence. You know, and that's why the voice is privileged, because you got to hear a voice. It's in the present, and you know, all that stuff. And writing is about absence because it's already a trace left by someone who's absent, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So this presence absence thing happens a lot in him. And you know, the one piece of Derrida that I remember quite vividly is his earliest writing, which was it was his PhD dissertation on Husserl, and I can't remember, Speech and Phenomena, in which he, you know, and I was at the time I was totally into Husserl. I was totally into phenomenology, right? And phenomenology is all about presence, right? It's all about going inside and analyzing what you're experiencing right then, and he takes Husserl's writing about presence and just trashes it. I mean, it's so brilliant. It's one of the most brilliant things I've ever read, because he does exactly what you described, right? He goes into the text of Husserl, and he shows that every time Husserl refers to presence, there's absence in the description. It's you know, that the text itself is doing this work to suppress the bad opposition, the bad part of it, the bad pole of the opposition, the absence, and it's doing all this, but it's internally contradictory. So he's just, you know, I mean, he's so cool to read, because he is the ultimate close reader, I think, in that regard. I'm curious. I guess I can look it up. I'm very curious about his thing about Declaration of Independence, but I'll look up where that is. I wanted to mention my favorite pop culture reference to deconstruction, which is in Veep. There's an episode in which I mean, maybe I'm the only true fan of Veep. You know, watched it multiple times, but there's an episode in which Gary, who's Selena's body man, is preparing a dinner for her old law school friends, and he says, "Oh, I have a great idea. We'll do a deconstruction of pizza. We'll take pizza, we'll deconstruct it, and we'll et cetera, et cetera." And indeed, even in cooking, you do hear these references to deconstructing these old recipes, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then I just wanted to ask: is this just for, you know, this is my first time here, so I'm just curious. Is this the beginning of a series on Derrida, or?
Oh, it's actually the conclusion of our series on linguistics that kind of went on through for the last 3-4 months now, with a little detour into history. Yeah.
Okay, and the structure of these is a presentation that people respond to. So it's not any pre-reading for
Sometimes,
sessions.
Sometimes there's a text that we work through, but not this time. So yeah, this was more.
Gotcha.
Free
Gotcha.
form.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
In true Derrida, perhaps in a true Derrida fashion, there is no assigned kind of space for reading. There's an in-between space. But
Gotcha.
I do want to say thank you for bringing up your some of your points, especially the one about presence versus absence. It was in my notes. I didn't really spend much time on it here, but it is a crucial point about this binary opposition of presence versus absence, which is also shadowed or paralyzed by being versus non-being, right? So present means there's being, non-present means, like it's absence, so there is no being. And of course, in speech and writing, that's the key pair to look at. The other thing I wanted to mention, this was, I guess, Joe IM'd me just now with his question about Aristotelian logic and the law of excluded middle, which, Derrida, if you listen to him, he's against all these sort of either or types of statements. How does it work with the law of excluded middle? Well, you have to really understand that Derrida follows the school of Hegelian thinking, and Hegel obviously is not an Aristotelian thinker, and he doesn't think in terms of these mutually exclusive, right? So he's thinking about categories that are by necessity overlapping, right? And in fact, most living things do not really follow Aristotelian logic. They are in fact part of Hegelian domain. Society is neither this nor that, right? It's both. It's always in the state of flux. It's always in the state of kind of indeterminacy. And so this analysis of Derrida of society and of people and of language, it is warranted that he should not be using Aristotelian type of categorization and thinking in terms of opposites that are mutually exclusive. So they're not. They're actually part of the sort of these theoretical poles that are opposed. But in fact, there's, like I said, the true substances in between.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Todd, thank you very much for your comments. Really appreciate that. And all the previous, presentations on this linguistics are available on our YouTube channel, 52 Living Ideas. So you can see them there. And it's quite impressive, the range of, if you just search for language in that, you'll find all of Phil's presentations. It's been quite a series, and it's not just this particular series, but he has done a number of works on over in Barfield and lots of other people. So it's pretty extensive. All right. So Phil, I wanted to go ahead and talk about this at a much more deeper level. Is that okay?
Sure, of course.
Okay, because I want to just look at language, because what happens is that, we look at modern people and we kind of take things for granted. So firstly, I have to tell you, I've never read Derrida. I've never wanted to read Derrida. And I don't know much. Okay, so I'm talking about Derrida based on what I see him saying as compared to all the language that we have seen used in 52 Living Ideas. How does thou speak? How does so how is language used in these things? So this is kind of based on my my sense of many other things with very little knowledge of Derrida. Okay, so I could be completely wrong about many things here. So firstly, I have to tell you that Derrida is going to be most useful. I'll tell you where it will be most useful. What happens is that often language gets ossified. Living language gets ossified into these really rigid forms, which originally had some reason and life behind them, but they have lost all of it and they've just become these ossified blocks. And when you attack them with this kind of technique, they are taken apart, and some life flows through them. So I think that is the best use of it, of people, of ossified expressions. So that's one thing. Now, if you want to put it in the context of the language classification that, Mark Stallman and Center for the Study of Digital Life has, of oral, scribal, written, electric, and digital, really what Derrida seems to be pointing to is go back to oral version, because all the virtues that he's talking about are virtues of oral, with no written material at all, with everybody talking to each other continuously. It's completely fluid. Nothing is actually, everything is just like that. So it is basically saying that let's go back to oral. Okay, let's destroy everything else and let's go back to oral. That seems to be, his motivation, his style is all about taking up anything that is above oral. So that's my first observation. Second, I want to say, and this I want to show you how big this point is, this opposition that he's talking about. Many times it's not the opposition, it is orientation. It is like up and down. It's not like it is up, it is like from here, am I going up or am I going down? That's like an orientation that is there. And that is a physical orientation. Up and down is very big for us because we are vertical creatures. And we use it a lot. And actually, the reason, again, I'm saying he's just a brilliant, brilliant guy, because he really understands language. And he's taking apart everything of language from civilization onwards. And just, he understands it in really great detail about exactly how it works, why it works. And he's taking apart, virus is a beautiful way of doing it. This is not a living thing. He can't live like this in modern world. So he has to get into a living language of somebody actually using a language and take it apart. And that's why he can do stuff. Like, now, I want to show you how, if you look at work of people like Lakoff or Julian Jaynes, a whole bunch of people who have studied metaphors, based on whatever little I understand about language, I think that is, basically language is metaphors all the way through. It's just metaphors is a fundamental part of language. So I want to give a large example of the up and down. And what I'm saying is that if you understand how deep metaphors are, then you can imagine if those metaphors are taken apart, how much of your thinking will be deconstructed is unnecessarily long word. How much of it is destructed? It's basically destruction of all these metaphors that are used to think about things other than what the metaphor is starting with. So now I'm just going to talk about up and down from the book Metaphors We Live by Lakoff. So you can see the extent of the use of these terms, okay? And then imagine what happens if you take all of it apart. Imagine that you can't use any of this at all in any of your thinking. And then the question is, can you think at all? Okay, so up and down. Okay, this is going to be about 5 minutes. I'm just going to run through tons of examples of how pervasive this orientation is in our language and our thought. Happy is up, sad is down. I'm feeling up, that boosted my spirits. My spirits rose, you're in high spirits. Thinking about her always gives me a lift. I'm feeling down, I'm depressed. He's really low these days. I fell into a depression. My spirits sank. Health and life are up. Sickness and death are down. He's at the peak of his health. Lazarus rose from the dead. He's in top shape. As to his health, he's way up there. He fell ill. He's sinking fast. He came down with a flu. His health is declining. He dropped dead. Having control or forces up, being subject to control or forces down. I have control over her. I'm on top of the situation. He is in a superior position. He's at the height of his power. He is in high command. He is in upper echelons. His power rose. He's under my control. He fell from power. His power is on the decline. He is my social inferior. He's low man on the totem pole. More is up, less is down. Number of books printed each year keeps going up. His draft number is high. My income rose this year. The amount of artistic activity in the state has gone down in the past year. Number of errors he made is incredibly low. His income fell. He's underage. You're too hot. Turn the heat down. Foreseeable future events are up and ahead. All upcoming events are listed in the paper. What's coming up this week? What's up? High status is up, low status is down. He has a lofty position. She will rise to the top. He's at the peak of his career. He's climbing the ladder. He has little upward mobility. He's at the bottom of the social hierarchy. She fell in status. Good is up, bad is down. Things are looking up. We hit a peak last year, but have been downhill since then. Things are at an all-time low. He does high quality work. Virtue is up, depravity is down. He's high-minded. She has high standards. She's upright. She's an upstanding citizen. That is a low trick. That is underhanded. I wouldn't stoop to that. That would be beneath me. He fell into the abyss of depravity. That was a low down thing to do. Rational is up, emotional is down. Discussion fell to the emotional level, but I raised it back to the rational plane. We put feelings aside and had a high level intellectual discussion on the matter. He couldn't rise above his emotions. So what I'm saying is that, like, on everything, the up and down goes through everything. So if you say, okay, I'm just going to take down up and down, you're going to take out a lot of thought that is there. A lot of it is going to be taken down. Go ahead, Phil. Any thoughts?
No, this was great. That's my only thought, I guess. No, I think this is right. I mean, these binaries are guiding principles of organizing our thinking, of classifying, of orienting us in the world, of both of thought and in physical world, right? The fact that deconstruction can be applied in architecture actually signifies the fact that it has, these things don't just stay in the kind of theoretical realm, right? They're visible and manifest in everyday life, and eventually they are incarnated in just about everything. So yeah, this was great.
So one point here is that, see, it's a question of existence and consciousness. Existence just is, but in consciousness, living being, we have to make distinctions of which direction should I go. And what he's attacking is consciousness itself. He's just saying exist. In order to actually live and choose, you have to orient yourself. And these are all orienting methods, the way in which we are conscious, way in which we live. And you take that apart, then you're basically, you just are, you just stay in one place. So I think it is attacking kind of consciousness at a very deep level of language, of organizing things. And you can get by reacting things if you're in the oral culture. If everything is all around you and everything is in your habits, everything is in your familiarity, everybody, then you can definitely do that. And that's what, so anyway, next up is going to be Dave, followed by Katie. Dave.
Yeah, I wanted to talk translation for a while, about linguistics, remembering the studies of the Tao and the Gita, that we were having sessions and there'd be 5 or 6 different translations, each completely different, because of course, I'm a poor American that barely knows English. And I am so jealous of the folks that are fluent in several languages. I think it helps your understanding, your knowledge, your wisdom. But I think, as I said, as dumb Americans assume it's just a one-to-one association, rock in this language is rock in Espanol and rock in something else. and it's not. And to see the different translations and the different words, and what got me about the Tao is this word, the way. And in English, it's a pretty simple thing. You know, what's the way downtown? Well, you go that way. But in Chinese, apparently it's all the understanding of life. And it's just fascinating to me. But the insights, even reading several different translations of the Bible of a single verse, how different people have translated, it really can help give insights, because a lot of times these meanings are a little deep. Maybe, thank you.
Thank you, Dave. That's a great example. Okay, that's a great example of what language is. Okay, language is using this multiple metaphors, actually a symphony of metaphors, in order to grasp what is. What is enormously complex. You know, you're trying to understand the Tao. You're trying to understand, you know, reality itself. And you need every metaphor you can use. So why is it that you find multiple translations useful? Because each person uses different set of words, different combination of metaphors in order to point to the same thing. It's like you're trying to look at an elephant and people get different parts of it. And all of them together actually help you understand. So you have to get used to the metaphor. The thing is that you can't fall for one metaphor. I mean, the thing is that a lot of politics, when there's a great example that Maritza brought up, is that people deliberately use the connotations of the language, connotations of the metaphors, in order to put other people down and put themselves up. You say, I'm pro-life, or I'm pro-choice. Both of them are actually trying to use the pro connected with a positive thing to give themselves a false level of positiveness as compared to the other people. So what you have to do is you have to understand how metaphors are used in language. And when somebody is trying to con you by doing a combination, you have to be able to spot it. So you have to have like so much of a mastery of metaphors, being able to generate metaphors on the fly, come up with new metaphors yourself in order to understand what you're understanding, that you can take all of this into your account. What Derrida at his best is reacting to is dead metaphors, which are now sitting on your chest, stopping you from grasping life and to do thinking. And that's one way of taking it apart. A better way of taking it apart is to look at multiple translations, look at things from multiple ways, listen to different people talking about the same things, and use that entire richness that language has. Do not try to dumb it down, and do not try to go back to the oral, which is an easy kind of cop out, but embrace the fact that you know only some things, that what is far more grander than whatever you can capture in words. Keep listening to everybody who's trying to do the same thing and try to put it together. I mean, your example of Tao, what we did with Tao and the Bible, is exactly the same thing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Next up is Katie, followed by Maritza. Katie.
I have two separate comments. My first is that our personal experiences get into the metaphors too. So if you say like, it's like not getting invited to a party. Well, if you're invited every day to a party and you didn't get invited to one, it's going to feel different than if you get invited to 5 parties a year and you didn't get invited to one. So if your experiences are still getting into the metaphors. And my second comment is about distance metaphors. Like I think also like I see that with Hinduism, and they get to the idea of the center and the periphery, that you're going farther away. Or and modern society, I think we're also going more towards like it's getting there, like instead of this idea of like it's improving or it's going downhill, we're often using more like distance metaphors. I think that's going to become more.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other thing, this is again a great example. Different cultures have different metaphors, and those actually, there is a correspondence between how they think about life. So for example, a lot of the Indian view is a circular view. There is a tremendous amount of circularity going on, and there is a kind of, center and periphery going on. Whereas Western is mostly kind of, a lot of the thinking and a lot of the metaphors are things like a train moving in one direction. So, and the, Chinese are completely different. And the thing is, I don't understand any of it because I'm not a, big student of language or these cultures, but like even the way in which the characters, how Chinese is written, that one single character actually strikes you and gives you meaning, whereas a particular character like B or C means nothing until you actually read the sentence, whereas the Chinese character will hit you. So the way in which the writing is being processed by our consciousness in Chinese is different from the alphabet. The Indians use a lot of the sound part, the Om sound. So there is something about the oral, which is very deep in Indian culture. Again, I don't understand that. But what I'm saying is that this is a very complex field, and all of this is going on at the same time. Next up is Maritza.
I love that you pointed out this the idea of, the both you and Dave, that the multiple different metaphors help you to they ultimately help you to understand better. I think also, if we're looking at specifically what I believe, because I'm not a student as either of Derrida, I think that is one of the best ways to combat that which he's identifying for us. So he's saying that, he's pointing out these contradictions and these like he's saying, these are dead things, dead metaphors, and that it becomes problematic in our interactions with each other and with people when we take these metaphors as the ones to be using. I think that the practice of seeking more than one translation, even if you're not literally seeking a different language, just in general, even you've brought up to us before that one of the best ways to study something, by your opinion, is to rewrite it in our own words to aid with understanding. And I think all of these different examples, and I will put the small plug that they're all things that we do here together with 52 Living Ideas. All of these different methodologies are ways to counteract the negatives that I'm hearing identified in this, written thing, this written world in which we live now, because Derrida is saying that in writing, it's so easy to lose sight of the unmentioned things that are alluded to, but losing sight of them does not negate their affecting us. So we are still influenced by, the absence that's not labeled when the presence is labeled. And if we forget that, it may be to our detriment. And I think the Derrida is saying it is, in fact, to our detriment. But I think our practice of looking at other metaphors and other translations, and not, as you said also before, not falling in love with this one way, this one path as the only one, that then allows us to be more limber and hopefully never actually forget that the unnamed still exists. I think that helps with the problem that we are identifying here in linguistics and in writing.
Yeah, let me give you one example that you may not be very familiar with. On Mondays, we have somebody who runs this poetry meetups, and they do collaborative poetry, okay? But look at what goes on. in the collaborative poetry that you do, okay? That is really the solution, okay? Because what you're doing is that you're trying to say, okay, I'm writing a poem about this. It's a group of people, not just one person, a group of people trying to write a poem. What are you doing when you're writing a poem? You're trying to find the best metaphors to capture what you're saying, and you put it down. And then somebody listens to that and they add their own piece that connects to it with it. And it goes on and on. So you get all the connections, all the richness of understanding that each person has. When they are ready, they go ahead and put that. And all of it is put together. And then, which is the most miraculous thing, you guys actually edit it. Okay, so now it is in written form. Okay, you've moved it from your consciousness, you've spoken it out, you've put it in the written form, and then you are reorganizing it jointly. And people are letting other people touch the words that they wrote. And they're saying, yes, 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 you're right. This one, if I move it from here to here, that is actually what the scribal method is. You understand few things. You understand several. There is several things presupposed here. Okay, it seems like a very simple thing. Okay, but look at the principles behind it. Okay, you're saying that, this topic that we are writing about is really a grand topic. Okay, I understand some things about it, but there is more to be understood. And all of these other people are also trying to understand it. And I respect their consciousness and their own interpretation, their own perspective on this. And I want to learn from them. At the same time, I want to share my perspective with them. We jointly put things out externally on this document, which everybody can see. And then we can mull over that. Now we have produced something new in reality, which is a result of what happened inside us, inside all of us, and then we interact with it to make it better. So you have the writing shaped by this envelope of oral conversation between multiple people. And that is exactly what the scribal mode is. And that actually has the several levels of corrective mechanisms to solve some of the problems that Derrida is talking about. But it's a very messy system. And it's all about constructing and not about destructing. So that's, what do you think of the example?
Yeah, I'm a little bit familiar with that. No, it's what came to mind immediately is this week, actually, we had, we stayed in one group, and we're a little bigger than we usually are in the one group. And we had almost 3 pages like of lines, and everybody was very hesitant to delete lines. And so we made them all into the poem. And so first, I gently always remind folks that I invite them to no longer consider them their lines, but to consider them our lines, the collective we. And we gave a, almost final read of what we had cohesively. And somebody very hesitantly, very tentatively was like, I almost hate to say it, but I really think, well, I mean, if it were my poem, I think like a good 1/3 of this needs to go. And the moment it was said, and I was like, well, we could, well, I don't want to touch anyone's lines. I said, okay, give me a theme that you see where you see some redundancy. And then I said, and I invite you all to remember these are our lines. And once that was reminded and very gently and said, hey, we're doing this respectfully, nobody's picking on you. It was like it gave permission, or everyone else got bolder, and we truncated it to 2 pages. And there was no one person who said, get rid of, Susie's lines, or get rid of, there was none of that. It was very much a group effort. And it's it was like the most brutal cutting of lines that we've ever done. You know, we've been doing this about 1.5 years now. But it was necessary, and it truly enriched the poem at the end there. So it was kind of like we all learned, and what we discovered was that the same concept had been being stated over and over, but in different ways. And we were able to remove that, and we left it just once, and it ultimately had so much more impact. So it was kind of a nice way to truncate.
Wonderful. Thank you. Phil, how was the series?
I loved it. I mean, a lot of fun preparing, and you know, I feel like the best way to learn is to teach and to present. So as I prepared, I learned a lot myself. So this was great.
Yeah.
I hope you guys learned it too in the process.
Yeah, I thought this was just wonderful. I mean, the way in which you presented all these thinkers, and I really like this style of presentation where there is really fairly limited amount of presentation, like 10-15 minutes, and then there is a conversation, and you can come back. And it's just wonderful. So thank you very much. And so two things, folks. Phil also does a series on great plays. So we're going to be doing that. Phil, do you think we'll be ready for it next week, or do you want to coming Sunday, or do you want to launch it a Sunday after that, or do you want to decide later on?
Yeah, maybe let's talk first, and
let's talk. Yeah, we might probably, because we have to give some time for people to read plays. So I don't want to keep it too short a notice. What we have done is that we've done a poll. Everybody has voted, and we're going to analyze the votes and come up with something that works for everybody. So that's a great series. And I'll also talk to Phil about what he wants to do next. So that's the plan. I also want to tell you that tomorrow we are launching a series on Aristotle's Poetics. So that's going to be very special. It's amazing work. I said that it was it was the starting of aesthetics, and another person who runs the Toronto group pointed out, oh, there is a great dialogue by Plato that you need to do. So I have invited him to come and talk about that whenever he wants, which is always good. But there is a lot to Aristotle. So I strongly recommend that. That's going to be on Thursdays. And we've got amazing meetups. We do meetups, as you know, every day, something or the other at 8 p.m. So look forward to seeing you soon. And again, thank you very much, Phil. This was just great.
Thank you all.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Phil.